I didn't find out immediately that my bedroom had been sold. Such things are rarely announced directly. They manifest gradually, like a crack in the wall that you initially mistake for a shadow. I noticed it in small things. My belongings started to disappear. Not abruptly, not roughly, carefully, as if they were simply being moved for now. In old age, the word for now always sounds suspicious. I opened the wardrobe and saw an empty space. My coat used to hang there, old, warm, familiar, like the morning itself. It wasn't thrown away. It simply ceased to exist. I stood and looked at the hanger, and a strange feeling rose inside me. Not anger, not fear, bewilderment. As if I had forgotten something important, but couldn't remember what exactly. Later, the bedside table disappeared. Then the armchair by the window. My armchair. I had sat in it for years, listening to the rain, thinking, falling asleep, and waking up. It was taken away so quietly that even the floorboards didn't creak. When furniture leaves without a sound, it means that the decision was made in advance. I didn't ask immediately. At my age, questions are often asked cautiously, as if they might offend someone. I'm used to observing first, then understanding, and only then speaking. But when I entered the room and saw a stranger's bed, neatly made, without any traces of my life, I understood. This was no longer observation. This was a fact. They told me that the room had been sold, not as a thing, but as an opportunity. A good price. You hardly slept there anyway. It will be more convenient for you. These words were spoken calmly, without malice. And that was the hardest part. When your space is taken away without a fuss, it means that you are no longer considered part of the decision. I stood in the doorway and felt something slowly settling inside me. Not breaking, settling. A bedroom is not just a room. It's a place where a person is alone with themselves, where the body rests and memory doesn't pretend. And this place was sold, without my consent, without my participation, as if along with the bed, they also sold my right to peace. They offered me another place, a small room, temporary, for the time being. Temporary is the most dangerous word in old age. It often becomes permanent. I nodded, not because I agreed, but because at that moment I needed time. Time to understand exactly what had been taken from me. That night I slept poorly, not because of discomfort, but because of the emptiness. I closed my eyes and felt that I wasn't lying where I should be, as if I had been moved not to another room, but to someone else's life. And somewhere between these feelings, for the first time in a long time, a thought arose in me that was both frightening and clear. If they could sell my bedroom, then they have already sold something more. I just don't know what yet. Sometimes life brings small surprises. Link in the description. And it was this thought that kept me awake until dawn. Because sometimes the loss of a room is not the end. It's the beginning of something that will turn everything you believed in upside down. Waking up in the new room, I didn't immediately understand where I was. This happens in old age. You open your eyes and for a few seconds you can't remember how you got here. But this time it wasn't about memory. The room was too unfamiliar, too neat. There wasn't a single trace of me in it, not a single thing that could tell that a woman with habits, fears, and a long life behind her had once lived here. I lay and looked at the ceiling, trying to listen to the house. But the house no longer responded. It sounded different, muted, as if I was in a corner where sounds don't linger. I slowly sat up, lowered my feet to the floor, and felt the cold. In the old bedroom, the floor was always warm, not from the heating, from habit. There, I knew where to place my feet, even in the dark. I walked around the room. The wardrobe was smaller. The window was higher. The light fell at a different angle, and because of this, my face in the mirror seemed unfamiliar. I caught myself trying not to make any noise, even though no one was sleeping, even though this was no longer their house any more than it was mine. The habit of being cautious becomes deeply ingrained, especially when you live for a long time expecting to be moved again. At breakfast, they spoke to me politely, even gently. They explained that it would be better this way, that I hardly ever used that room anyway, that now everyone would have more space. I listened and nodded, not because I agreed, but because I understood this conversation wasn't about convenience. It was about the fact that the decision had already been made, and I was being offered the opportunity to accept it. I noticed how carefully they avoided my gaze, how they hurried to finish their sentences. People always rush when they feel they're doing something wrong, but don't want to admit it. I wanted to ask, when did you decide that I no longer have the right to my place? But I didn't ask. I wasn't ready to hear the answer yet. After breakfast, I returned to my new room and began unpacking. There were fewer things than I expected. I was surprised not by the quantity, but by how quickly someone's life can be reduced to a couple of boxes. I held old photographs, letters, and trinkets that used to live in the bedside table. Now, there was no place for them. I folded them neatly, as if apologizing to them for not being able to give them their former home. At some point, I stopped. I had a key in my hand, small, old, with a worn head. I recognized it immediately. It was the key to that very bedroom. I had kept it for many years, even after the lock was changed. Not out of necessity, out of habit. It lay in the pocket of my robe, a reminder that I had my own place. I sat on the bed and looked at the key for a long time. It no longer fit anything. The door was different. The room was different. And suddenly, I felt that I was holding not metal, but a memory of a right that had been quietly taken away from me. Without discussion, without consent, without regret, I got up and left the room. I needed to walk around the house to understand where I was now. I walked slowly, listening to every step. In the corridor, I paused at the door of my former bedroom. Now it was locked. Someone else's. I didn't knock. You knock when you hope someone will open the door. But I already knew they wouldn't open it. That day I hardly spoke. Not out of resentment, but out of the need to conserve my strength. I needed to understand the scale of what was happening. It wasn't just a relocation. It was a redistribution of space, of roles, of significance. And if my bedroom could be sold, it meant that in someone's eyes I had already ceased to be a part of the house. I had become an appendage, background, something that could be moved without asking. I went outside and sat on a bench. The autumn was calm, without wind. People passed by, unaware that I had lost the room that was a part of me. And there was a strange comfort in that. The world didn't change because of my loss. Therefore, I had to decide for myself what it meant to me. I thought about how many years I had given in, how often I had agreed for the sake of peace, how I had made temporary decisions that became permanent. I didn't consider myself weak. I considered myself patient. But there's a fine line between patience and self-erasure. And it seemed I had crossed it a long time ago. In the evening, I returned to my new room again. It was still unfamiliar. But now I looked at it differently. not as a punishment but as a signal. When a person is deprived of space, only one thing remains: the inner space. And if that cannot be taken away, then not all is lost. I put the key in the box with the documents. It was a decision made without words. If my place now only exists on paper, then it's time to see what else is written there, where signatures matter. I didn't yet know exactly what I would find, but I felt that the sale of the bedroom wasn't accidental. It was a clue, and I was going to follow it. That night, I slept poorly again. But it wasn't confusion anymore. It was anticipation. Sometimes, to see the truth, you need to have the quietest and most personal things taken away from you. And then all that's left is to look straight ahead. After I put the key in the box with the documents, the house became quieter. Not because the sounds disappeared, but because I stopped reacting to them. Before, every step, every voice made me wary, made me try to guess the mood, to adapt. Now I felt as if I had taken a step back and was observing. This ability comes unexpectedly in old age. You suddenly realize that you don't have to participate in everything at once. I started with the papers, not out of distrust, but out of a need to regain a sense of reality. When your space is taken away from you, you want to find something solid, undeniable. Paper has that quality. It doesn't offer comfort, but it doesn't lie either. I took out the documents one by one, spreading them out on the table like cards before a long game. Not to win, but to understand what I was dealing with. Among the old contracts and receipts were things I hadn't seen in a long time. Signatures made many years ago. Wording that I hadn't paid attention to back then. I read slowly, sometimes going back to the beginning of the page, because the language of such papers doesn't take age into account. It demands attention, not weariness. And yet I read, because I felt that somewhere here was the explanation of how my bedroom could have been sold without my consent. I wasn't looking for a trick. I was looking for logic. And gradually it began to emerge. Not immediately, not abruptly. Like a pattern on an old wall that becomes visible if you look at it long enough. It turned out that much in this house had long ceased to belong to me in the way I thought. Not because I was deceived, but because I myself had once decided that trust was more important than formalities. I agreed. I signed. I didn't ask unnecessary questions. It seemed to me that family wasn't about papers. This thought was painful, but honest. I didn't feel anger. Rather, a quiet regret for my own naivety. In youth, it hurts more. In old age, it teaches. I suddenly clearly saw how, step by step, I had given away not only space, but also the right to make decisions. Not out of fear, out of a desire to preserve peace. And peace was preserved, but without me at the center of it. I put the papers aside and went to the window. Outside, ordinary life was going on. People were carrying bags, someone was talking on the phone, someone was laughing. No one knew that in this house, the elderly woman had been moved out of her own bedroom. And there was something liberating about that. My pain didn't become a spectacle. It remained mine. And that meant I could work with it. That day, for the first time in a long time, I left the house without a purpose. I just went. I didn't take a bag. I didn't plan a route. I needed space where my thoughts could move freely. I walked slowly, stopped, looked around. The world didn't demand explanations from me. It accepted my pace. I went into a small cafe I had never been to before. It was quiet and smelled of fresh bread. I sat by the window and ordered tea. When the waitress asked my name, I said it and heard it spoken aloud, clearly, without haste. And suddenly I realized how long it had been since I had been called by my name. Usually, Mom, Grandma, well, you understand. A name is an anchor. When it's not spoken, a person begins to drift. I sat with my cup and thought about what I had found. It wasn't just one discovery, but a whole chain of them. The sale of the bedroom wasn't an accident. It became possible because I had previously allowed others to make decisions for me. And this realization didn't humiliate me. It gave me support. Because if something was given away voluntarily, then something can be consciously taken back. Returning home, I felt a strange calm. Not joy. Not relief. The calm of a person who understood exactly where they had gone wrong. I sat down at the table again and took a sheet of paper. I began to write down not accusations, but facts.
When? What?
On what basis? This wasn't preparation for a quarrel. It was preparation for a conversation with myself and with the world. I noticed how people started treating me more cautiously, not because they knew I had found something.
Because they sense the change.
People feel it when a person stops being convenient. Even if he doesn't say anything, even if he still walks quietly around the house. I didn't go into the former bedroom anymore. I didn't need to see what was there now. It had already become a symbol, not a place. And I understood. What I found was capable of overturning not only their plans, but also my ideas about myself. I always thought it was too late to change anything. That age was an argument against action. But now, sitting at the table with the papers, I suddenly realized age is an argument for action. Because I no longer have time for self-deception. A small surprise is waiting in the description. In the evening, I went through the documents again and discovered something that made me hold my breath. It wasn't anything sensational, not a secret hiding place or a revelation. It was a single line, but it changed everything. It meant that my right hadn't completely disappeared, that I still have a voice. It's just that it hadn't been asked for a long time. I closed the folder and sat in silence for a long time, without moving. At such moments, old age reveals itself especially clearly. You don't rush into action. You give yourself time to accept new knowledge. It needs to settle, to become a part of you, not just a fleeting thought. I thought about what I used to believe, that if you were patient, everything would work out, that loved ones would always act fairly, that formalities spoil relationships. These beliefs weren't foolish. They were human. But now I saw their limitations. That night I didn't fall asleep right away again. But it wasn't anxiety anymore. It was a premonition. I felt that there would be conversations, decisions, perhaps even a trial. That word no longer frightened me. It simply became a place where words are recorded, not dissolved. The sale of my bedroom was the beginning. Not because it was the scariest thing, but because it was what forced me to look where I hadn't looked for years. And what I found could truly overturn everything I believed in. Not destroy it, rebuild it. And sometimes that's the only way to continue living. After that night, I woke up with the feeling that something inside me had fallen into place. Not completely, not definitively, but enough so that I stopped doubting the direction. I no longer asked myself if I had the right to understand what had happened. That question disappeared. It was replaced by another: how exactly I would do it without losing myself. The house lived its own life. Doors still opened and closed, voices sounded, decisions were made. But I no longer felt carried away by this current. I became something like a shore, I stood still and allowed what was happening to pass by, without carrying me away with it. It was a new state,
Calm.
a little cold, but necessary. I started asking questions. Not immediately, and not abruptly. I chose moments when conversation seemed safe. I asked about details, when, by whom, on what basis. I spoke quietly, almost casually, and that's what threw people off. People are used to defending themselves against attack, but not against calm interest. The answers were evasive, formal, sometimes irritated, and each such answer confirmed my feeling. There was something here that they preferred to keep hidden. I didn't argue. I didn't accuse. I listened. Old age teaches you to listen not to the words, but to the pauses between them. In those pauses was everything: anxiety, haste, a desire to close the topic. I left the conversations with even more questions, but also with greater confidence that I was on the right track. I returned to the documents again. Now I read them differently, not as a victim, but as a participant. I noted inconsistencies, dates, formulations that left room for interpretation. I began to understand that paper is not the enemy. It's a tool. And if others know how to use it, then I can learn too. One day, I went where I had previously been afraid to go. To an institution where they don't ask questions about age, but look at the papers. It was noisy and cold there. People spoke loudly, interrupted each other, argued. I sat and waited, without rushing. You can think well in cues. There you can see how many people carry their secrets and hopes within themselves. When it was my turn, I spoke slowly. I gave my name. I explained the situation without emotion. Not because I didn't have any, but because emotions rarely help when it comes to the law. I saw how the person opposite me carefully read the documents, how their facial expression changed. Not sympathy, interest. And that was important. They didn't pity me. They took me seriously. I left there with the feeling that I had taken the first real step. Not a loud one, not a final one, but a real one. I was no longer an observer. I had become a participant in a process that had previously unfolded without me. And this restored a sense of weight. Not physical weight, but a sense of purpose in life. The house greeted me cautiously. I felt them watching me, trying to understand what had changed. I didn't explain. I didn't threaten. I didn't share. I knew that some things must be done in silence. Otherwise they lose their power. My strength wasn't in loud words, but in the fact that I no longer backed down. I stopped feeling ashamed of my persistence. Before, I thought that asking questions meant disrupting the peace. Now I understood. A peace that depends on my silence is not worth preserving. And this understanding didn't make me harsh. It made me honest. In the evenings, I sat in my new room and wrote. Not plans or complaints, but thoughts. About how easy it is to convince a person that they are too late to fight. About how age is used as an argument against one's rights. And about how important it is to stop believing in that at some point. I no longer felt displaced. The room began to fill with me, slowly, reluctantly, but inevitably. I put a photograph on the windowsill, placed a book next to the bed. These little things restored a sense of presence, not in space, but in life. I knew there was still much ahead. Conversations, letters, perhaps a trial. That word no longer frightened me. It simply became a place where the shadow becomes visible, where the truth emerges from hiding and becomes part of the light. The sale of my bedroom was no longer just a loss. It became an entry point into a story in which I finally stopped being just a background character. And whatever happened next, I knew what I had found had already changed me. And that meant it was truly capable of overturning everything I believed in. During that period, I began to feel time differently. It stopped dragging or rushing away. It seemed to have stopped beside me and waited for me to tell it where to go next. This was unusual. All my life, time had decided for me when to get up, when to hurry, when to give in. And now it seemed to have handed me the initiative, and I didn't immediately understand how to handle it. I began to recall my past not out of nostalgia, but out of necessity. Memories were no longer a soft blanket to wrap myself in when I was alone. They became evidence. I recalled how this house had entered my life, which agreements had seemed temporary at the time, which words sounded like promises, and which like empty politeness. I saw the entire chain of events, which I had previously preferred not to connect into a single whole. Sometimes it became difficult for me, not from fatigue, but from realization. To understand that you weren't suddenly deceived, but gradually, means admitting that you agreed for a long time. This admission doesn't humiliate, but it requires honesty. I was learning to be honest with myself, just as I was now honest with the documents. I went to the institutions again, now with more confidence. I knew what to ask and what wording to use. I no longer apologized for my questions. I didn't rush to end the conversation. When a person speaks calmly and doesn't back down, they start to listen. Not immediately, but they do. I saw how the attitude changed. First formal, then attentive, then businesslike. This wasn't a victory. It was a return to normalcy. I ceased to be an elderly woman with problems and became a person with a situation. The difference is enormous. At home, the tension grew. It could no longer be hidden by politeness. Conversations became shorter, pauses longer. I felt them studying me, trying to understand how far I was willing to go. And at some point I understood. They weren't afraid of the court. They were afraid that I would no longer back down. I no longer made excuses. I didn't explain why it was important for me to know what was happening. I didn't prove that I had the right. I simply acted. And that was the most unusual thing for them. Because before, my consent had been given in advance, even before any discussion. In the evenings, I returned to my room and sat in silence. Sometimes I closed my eyes and just sat, allowing the feelings to pass through me. Sadness came often, for the lost time, for what life could have been like if I had asked questions earlier. But sadness was always followed by another feeling, self-respect, for the fact that I finally started, even if it was late, but not too late. I took out the documents again and reread the line that had changed everything. It no longer frightened me. It had become an anchor. I knew that a crucial step still lay ahead. That conversations wouldn't be enough. That a place was needed where words would be recorded and wouldn't disappear in the pauses. The court ceased to be a frightening word. It became a tool. Cold but honest. I thought about what I had believed before. That family would always protect me. That love overrides formalities. That age is a time to yield. These beliefs hadn't disappeared. They simply ceased to be unconditional. Now something else stood alongside them. The right to respect has no statute of limitations. One evening I caught myself realizing that I was no longer afraid of being left without this family. Before, this fear held me tighter than any promises. Now it had weakened. Not because I had stopped valuing these people, but because I had stopped valuing myself less. The sale of my bedroom no longer seemed like the main blow. It was the beginning of a conversation that I had put off for too long. And now that the past had ceased to be silent, I knew the next step would be the last preparatory one. After that, the open road would begin. The one where it would no longer be possible to pretend that nothing was happening. I closed the folder and carefully placed it on the table. At that moment, I understood. I was ready. Not for a fight, for clarity. And clarity, as it turned out, is stronger than any walls, even if they're sold without your consent. The decision to go all the way came without any loud thoughts. It didn't take the form of a promise or an oath. It simply became a part of my morning, like breathing or the light outside the window. I woke up and understood. I couldn't delay any longer. Not because circumstances were rushing me, but because everything inside me was already ready. I wasn't in a hurry. I brewed tea, let it steep, sat by the window, and watched the courtyard fill with activity. People were leaving their homes, cars were starting, someone was talking on the phone. A normal morning. The world didn't know that for me. This morning was a turning point.
And there was something right about that.
Important decisions rarely require witnesses. I gathered the documents neatly, without fuss. I checked everything against the list I had made the day before. The papers no longer seemed heavy. They were simply objects doing their job. I noticed that my hands weren't trembling. This surprised me. Before, even the thought of such a step had caused an inner chill. Now it was gone. There was a focused calm. On the way, I wasn't thinking about what I would say, but about what I would no longer say. I wouldn't apologize for my age. I wouldn't explain why my personal space was important to me. I wouldn't prove that I wasn't superfluous. All of that had already been done by my life. Now it only remained to formalize it. The building I entered was cool and austere. Stone, glass, even voices. Here they didn't ask how you felt. Here they asked what you had. And I had something to show. I spoke slowly, clearly, without rushing. I stated my name. I recounted how my bedroom had been sold, what decisions had been made without me, what rights had been ignored. I didn't raise my voice. There was no need. Silence listened more attentively than shouting. I felt something inside me finally straighten out. Not in the room, but earlier. In every word I uttered without hesitation. I saw how they listened to me, not as an elderly woman with a grievance, but as a party to the proceedings. This feeling was new and almost forgotten. When I left, it was bright outside. The sun was high in the sky, and the world continued to live its life. I didn't feel relief or joy. I felt the completion of one stage. It was as if a long, arduous journey had finally led me to a crossroads where I could choose a direction, instead of simply being pushed along. The house greeted me differently. I noticed it immediately, not in words, but in the pauses, in how conversations fell silent when I entered the room, in the way they looked at me. I was no longer part of the background. I had become a variable, and that changed everything. I didn't explain anything, not because I was hiding something, but because explanations were no longer my responsibility. I knew that events would unfold on their own. There would be conversations, perhaps attempts to negotiate, perhaps irritation. But that wouldn't undo what had been done. That evening I sat in my room and looked at the things around me. They were simple. A book, a lamp, a photograph. But now they belonged to me not out of habit, but by right. And this feeling was deeper than any reclaimed space. I understood. Even if my bedroom wasn't returned to me, I had already reclaimed the most important thing. I thought about what I had believed before, that if you endure, everything will work out, that love requires no boundaries. That age is a time of resignation. These beliefs hadn't completely disappeared. They had softened, become more honest. Now, alongside them, stood another understanding. Resignation without respect is not a virtue, but a surrender of oneself. When I went to bed, sleep came quickly, without anxiety, without expectations. I knew there was still an epilogue to my story ahead. Quiet, not immediately, but it would definitely come. Because what I found after selling my bedroom had already turned everything I believed in upside down. And there was no turning back. After everything, life didn't become quieter. It simply became more honest. In old age, this is a rare gift when the world stops pretending and you stop agreeing to that pretense. I didn't wake up in a new house. I didn't get back the bedroom where half of my life had passed. But I woke up in myself, and that turned out to be more important than any walls. The house gradually got used to me again. Not like before, unconditionally and out of habit, but cautiously, as if redefining the boundaries. I felt it in the little things, in the pauses before words, in how they asked instead of telling, in how they looked around before deciding something. It wasn't warmth, it was recognition. And at my age, I already knew the difference. I lived slowly, sometimes very slowly. The morning began with tea and the light in the window. I was no longer in a hurry to be useful. I didn't look for reasons to earn my place. My place no longer depended on being convenient for others. It existed on its own inside me. And because of this, even my steps became more confident, though not faster. Sometimes I returned in my thoughts to that bedroom, to the walls that knew my nights, my fears, my dreams. It hurt a little, not because of the loss, but because of how easy it was to give away something that was a part of me. But this pain no longer destroyed me.
It reminded me
That no space should be more important than one's own dignity. I was no longer afraid of loneliness. It had changed. Before, it was an emptiness into which I was pushed. Now, it was a silence in which I heard myself. There was no threat in this silence. There was breath in it. Sometimes solitude is not the absence of people, but the return of boundaries. The documents lay in the drawer. I rarely took them out. They were no longer a weapon or a defense. They became a reminder. I have a name, a history, and a right. That was enough to no longer doubt any of my steps. I noticed that I started speaking differently, slower, more clearly, without excuses. My no became calm, and my yes became conscious. This surprised those around me more than any loud words. People don't expect firmness from the elderly. They expect compliance. And when they don't get it, they are forced to reconsider their expectations. Sometimes people would approach me and say that I had changed. I smiled. I didn't argue. I knew that it wasn't me who had changed. It was my attitude towards myself. And that is always noticeable from the outside. I often thought about what I used to believe in. That love justifies silence. That patience is a virtue without limits. That age is a time to retreat into the shadows. These beliefs weren't false. They were incomplete. Now the main thing has been added to them. Respect is not a reward, but a foundation. When the house fell silent in the evening, I no longer listened intently. I didn't need to guess whether I was needed. I knew the answer, and this knowledge was quiet but strong, like an old tree that has weathered too many storms to fear another one. Sometimes I imagined what I would say to my former self, the one who still believed that losing a room wasn't that important. I would say quietly, without reproach, if they took your place, then it's time to take a stand. Not for the sake of fighting, for the sake of yourself. After they sold my bedroom, I didn't find a document or a line in a contract. I found a boundary, the very boundary I had avoided crossing for too long. And this boundary truly overturned everything I believed in, not destroying it, but purifying it. Now, when I fall asleep, it doesn't matter where the bed is. What matters is that I am lying in my own life, and no one can move me out of it anymore.